Hello, and welcome to this new video discussion of the Memory and Future Club of the Association of Former UNESCO staff members. Today in focus, the Man and Biosphere program of UNESCO just turned 50 in November 2021. This is a major UNESCO intergovernmental scientific program that seeks to forge a new way of understanding the natural world and the role of people in it. It was ahead of its time when it was created in 1971 and is still innovative in promoting approaches to economic development that are socially appropriate and environmentally sustainable. Joining us on this issue, we have Philippe Pypaert, who served for many years in UNESCO's field offices in Beijing and Venice, and is now at UNESCO headquarters, dealing in particular with thematic networks of biosphere reserves, the MAB youth network, and cross-sectoral initiatives on education for sustainable development. Also with us, Thomas Schaaf, who worked in UNESCO's Division of Ecological and Earth Sciences until 2013, particularly on drylands and mountain ecosystems. He served there as director ad interim and as secretary of the UNESCO MAB program. Thomas, could you please explain what is the MAB program and what are biosphere reserves?
Thank you, Nida. Yes, indeed. The Man and the Biosphere program has now 50 years, as you mentioned. And at the time when the MAB program started, it was a real novel scientific program. Why? The program is concerned with the environment and the conservation of the environment. And there had been earlier international scientific programs like the International Biological Program, but the MAB program was completely new in the sense that it also took into account the human factor when it comes to the environment. That was new, that didn't exist, and therefore you have the name Man and the Biosphere. Of course, today you would choose a slightly different name, but I think the idea is there. The program looked at the interaction of people with their environment. And what was also new in terms of scientific research was that it was not only a single disciplinary program, but an interdisciplinary program. You had to have conservation experts, biologists, foresters, etc., but also economists, sociologists, because you're dealing with people, and even lawyers, environmental lawyers. So you had really an international, interdisciplinary scientific program that has now existed for 50 years. Now, the MAB program was structured into different themes, pertaining to specific environments such as mountains or drylands or tropical forests or coastal areas and wetlands. For example, one theme was called Impact of Human Activities on Mountain Ecosystems, or else Impact of Human Activities on Drylands. So you see the factor human being came into the fore in novel scientific research as regards the environment. Now, one of the themes that was also included in the MAB program from the early start was the conservation of natural areas and the genetic material they contain. Now, that sounds very much conservationist, but that led to what is called today a biosphere reserve. And I'm sure my colleague Philippe will talk more about biosphere reserves and how they developed over time later on. Now, what are biosphere reserves? Biosphere reserves contain protected areas, say a national park or a nature reserve, that are legally protected so that nature can develop on its own. But it's nice to have protected areas, but you may have to ask also the question, what about people? People also live somewhere in this world. People share the planet with animals and plant species. So how do you combine the two, people and conservation area. And again, that was quite novel, that came with the MAB program to resolve the issue of A, conservation, but second, use of natural resources. And that was done through a specific zonation pattern. A biosphere reserve has core areas, legally protected conservation areas, but also buffer zones that ward off any negative impacts from the outside on the natural environment. And a third zone, which I find the most interesting one, which is the transition zone or development area. This is the area where people live and make a living, but in a sustainable manner without disrupting the environment by conserving the natural resources in a sustainable manner. This is what makes a biosphere reserve: conservation, but also development, economic development in a sustainable manner, as well as research and education on how to make an area function as a biosphere reserve in a holistic manner, in a management scheme that considers both conservation and development at the same time.
I would start by saying that you have to imagine that all what Thomas just explained about the genesis of the program and the network of biosphere reserve was happening in the early 70s. At that time, we were not even using terms like sustainable development and, of course, many concepts that appear later. And I would say that the MAB program, the World Network of Biosphere Reserve, were definitely an anticipation of all this new focus at that time, and what has been then absolutely recognized in the '92 conference in Rio and in all the follow-up we will talk about this morning. So that was interesting because for sure the MAB program as a scientific program needed, let's say, also its own labs to explore, to investigate, to explore all these new issues, in particular, as Thomas said, this relationship between humans and their environment, because that's where problems arise and where we have to find solutions. So, but very special kind of labs. I mean, these are territories, they are made of as Thomas said clearly, also communities. So it's quite sensitive issue to call them reserves first of all, and also to consider them as kind of laboratories where we can investigate scientific issues and not only. The network was structured initially, as Thomas said, so and the biosphere reserve are structured around these three zones, and since the beginning. Even in '95, the program then in the Congress adopted the Sevilla strategy and its statutory framework. So there was a need at that time to formalize, let's say, how biosphere should be structured and developed, and all the programs should develop its activities. As a matter of fact, we observed that in any case, the early nominations of the first biosphere reserve, which were nominated, were mainly major parks and protected areas of the world, and probably this was in at that time what the member states wanted to bring into the program. And even after the Sevilla strategy was adopted in '95, we were still observing that even if the model was very clearly indicating we needed to build biosphere reserve around protected areas, but with communities and settlements, and really to have a chance to observe what happened at the interaction between humans and their environment, and also to explore possible solutions and innovations to solve those issues. We were remaining very much considered as a program dealing with nature protection and protected areas. And more recently, a few years ago, after the Lima Congress in 2016, the program has decided to start a process of reviewing those nominations and the structure of the biosphere reserve, and to stick to the initial model, the original model, because it has not changed in 50 years. But that was the application, which was not always as rigorous or as expected. So we entered into an excellence, what we call the process of excellence, more than a kind of exit strategy, but to really strongly recommend that some biosphere could be, let's say, delisted and leave the network, while we would then reinforce the whole network and so keeping on board all those really implementing that design as expected. I think it's very healthy process in the program when you consider that the very original dimension is really in this combination of protected areas and transition areas where development occurs. So we wanted to keep that as strong as possible in the program. And I would say that then this process of excellence led to a few withdrawing of biosphere reserve, but at the same time an overall, let's say, strengthening and reinforcing the whole program and the whole network in recent years. This process is not over. I mean, we have reviewed all existing biosphere reserve. We're talking about more than 700 biosphere reserves around the world today. And so we can say that today they all stick to the model. So they have, of course, and they are built around a protected area. Sometimes it's a large area. Sometimes it's not more than 5 or 10% of the whole biosphere reserve. They all have that. Of course, that's where we build the biosphere reserve around those protected areas. They have the buffer zones and they have the transition area, which is today a quite large area. Biosphere reserve and the network needs a strong connection, a strong interface with the society at large. We never had in mind developing this program to cover the entire world with biosphere reserve, or to have a particular percentage of the Earth's surface covered by biosphere reserve. Even if today that those figures are quite relevant, the purpose is that this program and these biosphere reserve have to influence, inspire the society and policies and communities to engage more concretely into and follow more sustainable pathways in their development. That's the purpose of the
UNESCO
program.
has been developing over time multiple designations of an environmental nature. What would be, for instance, the connections, interactions, and possible synergies between the 738 biosphere reserves, the 218 natural sites on the World Heritage List, and the 177 UNESCO global geoparks? Maybe Thomas can answer this question.
Yeah, thank you, Neda. Indeed, actually, UNESCO is the only United Nations agency that is listing sites at the international level. No other UN agency is doing that. So this is a very special feature of UNESCO. Now, World Heritage Sites, Biosphere Reserves, Geoparks, you may wonder, how come there are 3 different designations? Isn't one designation enough? The point is simply to explain what are the differences so that you see why there are 3 different global networks of sites. Most people know the World Heritage Convention and the World Heritage Areas, and these are defined as areas of outstanding universal value. Outstanding universal value. These sites are so fabulous that they are not only important to the country or the people that live in that country, but to all of humanity. So World Heritage Sites are the extraordinary sites. Biosphere reserves are a bit different. They also conserve the environment, but they are the typical sites, the representative sites of a country. Say a country has different ecosystems, mountains, islands, coastal areas, forests, etc. And these are quite typical, but they're important also for the conservation of biological diversity. And this is precisely what the role of a biosphere reserve is. They want to be model areas for sustainable development. And the third kid on the block, the geoparks that came a bit later, they look at geological sites that are important to explain the development and evolution of Earth's history. So they have a very didactic component inherent in the program. The similar thing of all these three designations is indeed also sustainable development. So there has been a convergence of the three different denominations and designations by UNESCO to conserve, but also to promote sustainable development. It is quite interesting, if I have just 2 minutes to add, some of the World Heritage Sites, biosphere reserves, and geoparks, they actually also overlap. Often more or less the same area has the three designations. Now, this is quite wonderful for a country because it adds to the prestige. The country can say, look, we are World Heritage listed, we are Biosphere Reserve listed, we are Geopark listed. And that helps often in the conservation of the area. And it may also help, especially for developing countries, in fundraising. But there are also a couple of challenges with that when areas overlap, because sometimes the three designations come under different authorities. Just to give an example, in China, World Heritage Sites, even if they are natural sites, come under the Ministry of Culture. Biosphere reserves are governed by the Chinese Academy of Sciences, and geoparks come under the Ministry of Natural Resources. So even if we are talking about more or less the same area, there are different institutions that come into play. And that makes it for managers of these sites not always easy. But nevertheless, it is fantastic when countries seek the different designations of UNESCO, biosphere reserves, World Heritage Sites, and geoparks.
Another distinctive feature of many UNESCO intergovernmental scientific programs in hydrology, geoscience, oceanography, or social transformation is the science policy interface that has been developed. How has it evolved through MAB, and are there synergies with these other programs?
It's a very challenging and very important one, Nida. Of course, as I said before, and also Thomas clarified that all designations have the purpose of promoting the idea of sustainability. So therefore, we definitely need also to influence and have an impact and have a dialogue with also the policy level, let's say. Perhaps the bigger challenge in the MAP program itself is that we work at different levels and we involve a high variety of stakeholders. Of course, we engage very much locally with the local communities and local decision makers and managers, and that's one first level. As an intergovernmental program, we are also encouraging our member states to have national networks of biosphere reserve and, of course, to be well connected with the policy making in a country. And then we have all this, let's say, global arena where, of course, we hope that program and that network could be very impactful. And that's the challenge, because when you mix all that, sometimes you see that high variety, for example, in the Congress of the program and the Congress of Biosphere Reserves, or different regional network meetings. So you see that's a very diversified community of stakeholders involved, and that's definitely an asset, but also a difficulty, because you cannot jump from one level to the other without re-elaborating a bit what you're saying, what you're doing. So that's where I see the major challenge. But definitely, I would say that the clearest characteristic of biosphere reserve locally is that they are a platform they usually associate in the management and development processes. They associate all stakeholders. So from the political side, from a park or reserve management side, but also from the private sector, the community itself, youth, indigenous people, they're all represented. And so ideally, they represent a participatory platform. And that's very interesting because I think that in terms of science policy interface, you really play an important role at that level. I would call it more a knowledge brokering. That's where we really, all stakeholders can engage in developing the knowledge we need to better manage and better develop our communities, but at the same way, they are in touch and can interact with scientists. As Thomas mentioned, we have this logistic support function, which is where science can come to serve the purpose of managing properly a biosphere reserve, but also can use these experiences called biosphere reserve as a learning and as an investigating place. So this knowledge brokering of the third function is very important. If you go on the national or regional level, I've seen several times, MAB national committees and scientists and local biosphere reserve engaging in projects, for example, to review and influence agricultural or rural development or tourist development policies at the national level. So that's something we have seen very often. If we speak also in terms of regional cooperation, for example, we have also transboundary biosphere reserve. So biosphere reserve which are established by at least 2 countries or 2 member states, or even 5 in some cases, and that's interesting to see. I witnessed that, for example, in Southeastern Europe, after the last war in the Balkan region, how countries which were in conflict a few years before were then pooling their resources and working together to look at nature protection across the borders, but also prosperity and sustainable development across the borders. And it's more than just having a joint management. It's really reestablishing dialogue and mutual understanding. So strongly contributing to the mandate of promoting peace in the world, I would say, which is the mandate of UNESCO as a whole. And globally, on all these arenas, that's very relevant. We are participating in various platforms, programs, or dialogues to really influence what will be the future of the planet. We have undercourse the COP15 of the Convention on Biological Diversity, discussing the very important post-2020 global biodiversity framework. And it's very important that national actors, ourselves as the Secretariat of the program, we are there to say that biosphere reserve and a program like the MAB program can play a role in implementing this global framework. For example, we do the same on various biodiversity issues, the UN Decade on ecosystem restoration. We cooperate with FAO, so we want also to have a say on the future of agriculture and food production in the world, so, and its interaction with biodiversity conservation and nature in general. So there are many levels and many opportunities to promote, to extract, let's say, the lessons learned, and to extract policy advice and elaborations that could influence all these platforms and decision makers at different levels.
You just mentioned the global challenges posed by these conservation efforts right now. How do you assess the accelerating effect of climate change and their impact on the sustainability and conservation of biosphere reserves?
Yes, of course, the challenges are many on the ground, and we hear about them every day. Climate change is definitely one which is worrying all of us. And as Thomas said, we have the chance to have a network of biosphere reserve distributed all over the world, but in different ecosystems, in different environments, which is very interesting because we can we come from the highest mountains in the Andes in Latin America to lowlands and estuaries, wetlands and deltas. We have a growing number of small islands joining the program, and sometimes the entire island is a biosphere reserve. And of course, they're on the front line of climate change effects. We have studied that in the past concerning, for example, the glaciers and mountains, and definitely smelting of glaciers in the Andes and environment, for example, is really worrying many biosphere reserve and communities where, for example, this will influence, and this is already influencing the production of quinoa and also other food productions in the region. We see that, of course, on coastal areas and deltas in particular, where we have the sea level rise impacted them frontally, I would say. And we have seen that in all regions, in the Mediterranean, in Asia. For example, the Mekong Delta is a biosphere reserve, and they have serious issues of sea salt intrusion in the groundwater, and of course the land subsidence and to move people and communities and cities and settlements. So these are serious issues. I mean, and of course the purpose through the program is to investigate those issues and possibly elaborate advice and elaborate or formulate policies so that to address that properly. We cannot change. There's something we used to say in the program, so we will not change the climate, but we can change the mind of people again, and we have to educate, we have to prepare the people and let them also explore innovation and good ways to address that. So around the Chad Lake in Africa, or along rivers, in deltas, in mountains, that's something we do. I don't have one particular example because this is a context for all of us. Climate change is a reality, and like we have to face that in every part of the world. That's what also biosphere reserve have to do, and they do it also delivering some important innovation on how to address that properly in the management of drylands. So we were discussing recently the idea of mobilizing oases, because we have several biosphere reserves established, in particular in the sub-Saharan region where we have also oases. And so you see, the purpose is not to conserve these oases as a particularly important system to fight desertification, but we want to learn from them. These are highly sophisticated systems. They are not natural systems. They are managed by man. Water is captured in the desert and distributed for uses and creating these islands of nature in a desert. So there's so much we can learn. And you see, the purpose of a program is not just to say, okay, we have a few biosphere reserves conserving these oases, but the real challenge is, can we learn something? Even if we live in Paris or in China, can we learn something from what they do and the way they do things? So to capture water, to use it properly, to safeguard the resources, and be productive in such a arid and hostile environment. So it's always about learning lessons and inspiring people even to innovate and use these practices to improve the situation worldwide.
If I may just come in with a complimentary comment, everything that Philippe said is absolutely true. When I was still at UNESCO, I was also in charge of a project on global change in mountain biosphere reserves, where we also studied climate change, but also economic changes in mountains. Now, mountains are very sensitive environments. Everybody knows about the retreat of glaciers, glacial melt, etc. So they're very good indicators for climate change. Now, we selected biosphere reserves of all the major mountain regions in the world: Latin America, North America, Africa, Europe, Asia, Australia. And we came up with a blueprint on how to study global and climate change using mountain biosphere reserves as test sites. And this continues today to have a platform, a research agenda, where countries can use their biosphere reserves to assess the impacts of global and climate change on the environment, but also on people. This was just a compliment to what Philippe said.
Well, we can go on with this notion of the research agenda, but also the sustainability efforts are always central to MAB and the Biosphere Reserve. So how would you say these contribute to the UN Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals approved by the international community?
Yeah, as we know, there are 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and I think they're extremely well formulated. They're fantastic. And when you think of biosphere reserves, you first think of development goal number 15, which is life on land, and sustainable development goal number 14, life below water, because that's the conservation aspect of biosphere reserves. Or else even 13, we just talked about climate change, the sustainable development goal on climate change number 13. But basically, all the 17 goals do come into play when we deal with biosphere reserves. For example, gender equality. Whenever a country proposes a site for biosphere reserve designation by UNESCO, there's a whole section in the nomination dossier to check out whether men and women have different accesses to the use of natural resources, or whether that is equal. Or, for example, education. Education for sustainable development in particular is an outright chapter for any biosphere reserve nomination to demonstrate that a biosphere reserve can also fulfill educational aspects for the benefit of people. Another one could be renewable energy or clean energy. Let me give you a concrete example. There is El Hierro Biosphere Reserve on the Canary Islands. It's one of the 7 Canary Islands, which politically belong to Spain. And the whole island is a biosphere reserve. And in fact, the policy of the island government is to become totally independent of fossil fuel. They're doing so by using solar and in particular wind energy, but also geothermal energy. Now, they are not yet there at 100%, but they have reached a level between 60 to 70%, which is really quite high. My own country, which happens to be Germany, is still below 50% with regards to renewable energies. So you see, biosphere reserves also in that respect of Sustainable Development Goal number 7 has a role to play as a model area for sustainable development. And you could list all the 17. I'm just looking at the list. Number 17 is, for example, partnership for the goals. Now, Philippe Pypaert, my colleague, just mentioned also the networking function of biosphere reserves. There are a number of regional biosphere reserve networks: EuroMAP for Europe, AfriMAP for Africa, ArabMAP for the Arab states, and so on, actually for all the regions in the world. And there are also thematic networks like mountains, islands, etc. So the whole point, and that is important for UNESCO, is to foster international collaboration across the national boundaries, to share information on how to deal with pressing problems that we have in the world. And this can be done through networking. And the world network of biosphere reserves at large is precisely fulfilling this function.
You have both demonstrated how important, how remarkable the network of Biosphere Reserve is today, a groundbreaking and innovative program. But I would like to turn to Philippe now to ask him what would be, in his view, its prospects for the near and more distant future.
That's an important question, and of course we all wish other 50 years of life to the program and expansion of the network. What said Thomas before is absolutely true and so important, and definitely we should never lose that vision and that perspective that we work globally as a network. And I think one of the hardest challenges considering sustainable development is just keeping this global vision, and while you act very, very locally, and something which is, it's not just a question that you address the 17 goals and that you could demonstrate that you have addressed properly each one of them, but then no one of us is allowed to do that for him or herself, you know, in its own city or garden or country. There's no sustainable Paris, there's no sustainable Mediterranean. There's only one planet we have to safeguard and definitely protect, and for sure having a network helps you understanding each other and having a different and global perspective on those issues that's so precious. Then, of course, through networks, we have a complete solidarity also, and there's a lot of projects which are cooperation among different member states, but also from Biosphere Reserve to Biosphere Reserve. And I see that so important. Just to complement what had been said before, so for example, you know, the very first objective, poverty reduction and fighting against hunger. So I think the Biosphere Reserve are very relevant also on these front lines. China as a country, for example, is working very much with Biosphere Reserve and also global geoparks to eradicate poverty, in particular when they have to deal with remote areas, rural areas, and so they operated those instruments, I would say, clearly to eradicate poverty in the country, together with many other policies, of course. And as far as food and hunger is considered, I mean, in 2015, we participated in the Expo 2015 in Milan, which was about the theme Feeding the Planet. And we were just showcased getting the more than 200 sites of UNESCO, mainly Biosphere Reserve, but also World Heritage sites and geoparks, which have a real experience in producing food. And of course, our purpose was to demonstrate we can face this challenge of feeding a growing number of people on the planet without destroying the planet itself. So there's a different equation we can explore, and these sites are doing it. So it's possible to produce, to develop, to settle yourself in a place without destroying your environment. That's the major challenge. So looking at the future, we definitely still have a lot to learn about that, to investigate, to propose about how to achieve these goals, even if we will then jump on other challenges like biodiversity conservation again, and ecosystem restoration, climate change. So for my vision is that in fact we could do a more systematic work and networking effort on particular issues, because that's our strength. And I hope also that other programs, even programs of UNESCO and sector, could really dive in this endeavor with us. I mean, we are a ground for working on any kind of issue. So as soon as a program would like to anchor its action in the reality of territories, of people, of communities, then the MAB program and its network of Biosphere Reserve offer itself as a perfect ground for that. And we are experiencing that in different occasions with the water program of UNESCO, of course, with a lot of Biosphere Reserve dealing with rivers, lakes, wetlands, and that's an important field of cooperation among programs. But for the social sciences, it's the same. For even cultural heritage or cultural diversity and so on. So that's and definitely the one I would mention is probably the most important, so engaging more with youth. I mean, we look at the future. Your question is about the future of the program. So to find a way to engage more concretely with them. We've organized already several global MAP Youth Forum, and we've realized that it's a wealth of enthusiasm, capacities for research, for action, which is there. And a young, let's say, component of the program, which has the same concern that like many other areas of the world. So in particular, the remote ones, when there's an outflow of population, if you don't offer young people an opportunity to study, to have a decent job, to live a decent life in the place where they were born, so they would live it, and that's putting in danger many areas of the world, including biosphere reserve and geoparks and world heritage sites. So it's not just a question of keeping them, but offering them a perspective and an opportunity to engage with us, to play the role. They are very concerned about what's happening. They have also a lot of solutions. They have the strength and enthusiasm to do it. So it's very important we would accelerate our work and engagement with them and find concrete ways to do it.
I know that Philippe is a very modest person, but I wish to congratulate him on his foresightedness, because he helped to launch the Global Youth Forum for the MAP program and the Biosphere reserves. That was wonderful, because this directly pinpoints us into the future. The action is for the young people. And when you see how dedicated and motivated they are to promote conservation in line with sustainable development, it's just fantastic to see that. And Philippe helped to create this platform for young people to express themselves. And I think it's wonderful.
On this note of enthusiasm and optimism, I would like to thank you both, Thomas and Philippe, for your time and availability and such an interesting discussion. That was all for today for the Memory and Future Club of AFUS. Do let us know what you think of our videos, and we hope to see you soon back online.